Good evening and welcome to Patriot Paths. My name is Lake Green, and tonight we are at the Thomas Clarke House, located on historic Princeton Battlefield in Princeton, New Jersey, the site of a decisive victory ending the 1776 campaign. Let's check it out. So we are standing on Princeton Battlefield State Park. This and many fields surrounding this area are part of the preserved area on which January 3rd, 1777, a decisive battle was fought here during the American Revolution that culminated in those 2 weeks of trial and hardship in which George Washington and the Continental Army went from the brink of destruction, disintegration, the end of the war, to remarkable victory. And in the span of just about 10 crucial days, give or take, Washington and some 2,400 to 4,000 men, give or take, took the cause of American independence from failure and defeat to hope and confidence once again. So if you want more details about the 1776 campaign and all the critical events that happened during that remarkable autumn fighting, all of the things from Brooklyn Heights all the way here to Princeton, August to December to January, check out my lecture series videos, which are also on the channel. I made them a couple years ago, and they give a pretty detailed overview of the major events, key events that happened in these several months that really, in my opinion and many historians' opinions, saved the country, made the country. Without 1776, without the events and the circumstances that happened at this time, there's no United States. But behind me is the Thomas Clarke House. Thomas Clarke and his family were Quakers. Many Quakers settled southern New Jersey, western New Jersey, and Pennsylvania during this time leading up to and well before the American Revolution. Quakers were pacifists, which means they were totally nonviolent and they believed in war never to be occurring under any circumstances. So, much like most of the Quakers around this area, I would not say all, but most, the Clarke family and Thomas decided not to participate in the armed conflict. So on the morning of January 3rd, 1777, unfortunately for him and his family and this 200-acre farm that once existed at the time, they were rudely awakened by gunfire and fighting early that morning. The reason there was gunfire around their farm was because of a remarkable tactical move that was greatly executed by the Continental Army during the night. Overnight, George Washington and several thousand troops, about 2,400 men, marched down frozen roads in secrecy from Trenton, between 9 and 12 miles from here, to Princeton. His goal was to attack the British garrison that was encamped here and maybe possibly march northward to the New Brunswick, to capture much needed supplies in warehouses. On December 26th, 1776, just a week or so prior, he had won a remarkable victory at Trenton, crossing the Delaware in an unlikely icy blizzard, marching down the road from the river many miles that night to Trenton and surprising the Hessian garrison of German soldiers who were stationed there at the time. However, the fighting was not to end. General Charles Cornwallis, below General William Howe, Lord Howe, was very angry, had to march all the way from New York City, had his leave disrupted, to Trenton with a detachment of men, and to deal with Washington now that these Hessians had been defeated. And so on January 2nd, he marched from Princeton towards Trenton, and he fought Washington at the Battle of Assunpink Creek, or the Second Battle of Trenton, just a day prior to the fighting here. And that was a mess for the British. The roads were muddy because the weather, surprisingly, was very warm. Their cannons, their wagons got stuck in the mud, and they were harassed for miles by American riflemen under the command of Colonel Edward Hand. And by the time they got to Trenton, they were exhausted and very, for lack of a better term, pissed off. And so when they finally attacked the Americans who were encamped behind the Assunpink Creek in fortified positions, they meant business. However, Washington's men held firm. With their backs to the Delaware River, they were able to hold the line, and hundreds of British soldiers were killed in a very bloody clash. However, Cornwallis ended the fighting, forced to end it actually with his British soldiers, because darkness fell. Back in Trenton, he gathered with his officers and said, "We've got the old fox bag now. We just have to go over and bag him in the morning." The reason why Cornwallis expressed such confidence that evening was because Washington had put his men with their backs to the Delaware River. Their boats were nowhere behind them. Most of the main roads that led up to Trenton were controlled by the British. In Cornwallis's mind, there was nowhere for Washington or his soldiers to retreat to. He said there was no way these rabble-raggy rebels would be able to figure out a way to march from where they were around the British Army and their soldiers in Trenton. He was in for a rude awakening. Remarkably, George Washington executed the daring plan. With his officers in a council of war, they decided to evacuate their positions along the Assunpink Creek. Secretly going down back roads, his men marched between 9 and 12 miles throughout the night around the town of Trenton. This march, and you can refer to earlier videos for more detail, I made them, was incredible because it required the American men to march around British soldiers, around their flank in Trenton. Any slight noise, any little sliver of detection would have meant the end of their entire army and the failure of their plan. Remember, these 2,400 men are all that remain, basically, and some militia that had come from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, not Continental regulars, of the American cause of independence at this time. If they fail, if they're captured, it's over. The war is over, and the Declaration of Independence a couple months prior is null and void. The revolution is lost. All right, Washington somehow is able to march his men around the flank of the British in Trenton, and by some hand of providence, luck, God, if you're an atheist, you just believe it's coincidence, fate will have it, the roads that had been muddy the day earlier, in the freezing cold of the night, temperatures plummeted to below freezing, and they iced over. And so all of the muck and mud on these roads that hindered the British the day prior, the Americans had no problems. The roads were frozen solid. The men froze and bled, but yet they marched 9 to 12 miles towards Princeton. A small detachment of American soldiers remained in their positions along the Assunpink Creek, burning fires, shooting guns, and making tons of noise throughout the night. The British, keeping watch in Trenton, thought that the Americans had not moved. When Cornwallis woke up in the morning, he could not believe his eyes. Somehow, some way, the old fox, General Washington, had outsmarted him once again. By 2 a.m., the Americans had marched along the Quaker Bridge Road, which is now part of Hamilton Township, New Jersey, here in Mercer County, and were on the way to Princeton. However, when the sun rose and dawn approached, Washington realized he was still well behind schedule. He was only a couple miles away from town, but he had intended to attack British outposts by that point. Around 8 a.m., some men split, some going to the post road and others staying on another route, into two groups. Washington tasked General Hugh Mercer and 350 men to take a road that ran behind the post road to cross a brook called Stony Brook. There was a bridge here that he wanted to destroy to delay the British advance should they decide to move from Princeton. The British were actually on alert. Commanded by Charles Mawhood, there were 3 regiments, the 55th, 40th, and 17th Regiments of Foot, and they were actually on patrol that morning, around 1,000 men. By the time that Mercer started to move, the British were spotted in the distance, and Charles Mawhood marched towards them. with men from the 55th and 17th regiments, along with some cavalry and cannon. Mercer and his 350 Continentals attacked. However, they did not know that there were that many British soldiers in front of them. They were quickly overwhelmed through the bayonet charge, and Mercer himself was surrounded. When ordered to surrender, he refused. He was bayoneted through the chest many times. He would be dragged back to this house, the Clarke House behind me, and 9 days later, a high-ranking officer, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, would die here in the house. The American lines began to break, and the Continentals, outnumbered, retreated. About 1,100 militia under the command of General Cadwalader arrived to support them, but these militia, not trained soldiers, upon seeing the other Continentals running away from the battle, also panicked and fled. It was at this pivotal moment, when it looked like the battle will be lost and the campaign a disaster, General George Washington, in the nick of time, shows up with riflemen, as well as Virginia Continentals, and in the prime moment, he orders the men to take a position and rides forward himself. Washington, calm under fire, rallies the American militia and says, "Parade forward with me, boys. There are only a handful of them, and we will have them directly." And they march forward. At this time, New England Continentals, under the command of Daniel Hitchcock, also arrive, and they march forward. And the Virginians, along with some artillerymen from Virginia, start firing cannons on the British, causing them to reform their lines. Washington leads the men forward and actually rides his horse in front of the soldiers. The British level their guns to fire, and legend has it that Washington and his horse are in the middle of the fighting, in front of both of the men, in front of his own men with muskets raised and the British who are about to fire back. One of his aides, who writes the report later, you can reference my other video, covers his eyes when the firing starts, as he thinks there's no way Washington will be alive without being shot. He'd probably be killed on that horse in between the firing. And when the smoke clears, Washington still remained calmly on his horse, with not a bullet touching him. He was unable to be wounded in battle, remarkably. Regardless, the fighting continues, and after a standoff, Washington personally leads the troops, and the Americans, with superior numbers, overwhelm the British and force them to retreat. And when their lines break, the Americans charge forward. This time, they have the advantage, and Washington shouts to his men, "Parade with me, my boys. It is a fine fox chase. Huzzah!" And they charge forward, breaking the British lines. About 194 British soldiers are forced to lay down their arms and to surrender. Within the town of Princeton, in part of what is now Princeton University's Nassau Hall, another group of British soldiers had barricaded themselves. General John Sullivan and his soldiers, along with the young Alexander Hamilton, start firing artillery into the walls. The 40th Regiment of Foot, I believe, were inside the building, and they were forced to come out and surrender under, tenuous circumstances. You have a cannon firing bullets into the walls of your building, which were stone and strong, but still, you couldn't hold out forever. With that, the Battle of Princeton was over. It is estimated that Americans had about 100 casualties, between 40 and 50 killed, the rest wounded. The British lose about 100 killed, maybe give or take, several hundred captured, and the campaign ends. American soldiers and British alike, they both died fighting for the causes of their countries, and they all deserve to be honored and respected. As dusk settles in, we'll take a quick walk around this house. It's under construction, but as I said, it was built in 1772 by Mr. Thomas Clarke. He lived here at the time with his sister, his family, and one enslaved woman. Even though Quakers were anti-slavery and devout pacifists, many still own slaves in this area. Fortunately, the slave who was living here was emancipated or freed 2 years after the battle in 1779. Typical New Jersey, Pennsylvania style farmhouse with fieldstone forming the foundation. Many windows strategically placed. At the time, remember, there is no electricity, natural light. And this house still stands today, the only structure on Princeton Battlefield that still survives from the time of the battle. And it was used as a field hospital where many men breathed their last breaths. General Hugh Mercer died in that house, Brigadier General. And he is remembered. Mercer County is still named after him today. Here is a plaque honoring Mercer. To the memory of General Hugh Mercer, the revered martyr of American independence, born in Scotland about 1720, educated as a physician, immigrated to America 1747, was appointed by Congress June 5, 1776, a Brigadier General in the American Army, was mortally wounded at the Battle of Princeton January 3, 1777, and died in the house now standing near this spot, January 12, 1777. This tablet was erected by Mercer Engine Company No. 3 of Princeton, New Jersey, October 1st, 1897, at its semi-centennial celebration. And there is the house behind me, the Thomas Clarke House, witness to the Battle of Princeton. And here is the field in front of me. Fighting took place. There is Mercer Road ahead. Behind me, on all the fields around this park, all the way out there and all across. Thank you so much for watching. It is so important that we remember our heritage and our American history, and that we make sure that not only for ourselves but for posterity, that we continue to carry down and pass on the lineage, the culture, the lifestyle, and remember all of the sacrifices of those that came before us. Thank you so much for watching. This has been the Thomas Clarke House at Princeton Battlefield. I'll see you next time on Patriot Paths. Have a wonderful evening. And last but not least, here's a very special thank you shout out from Mr. Green to the 7th grade class of 2027 at St. Gregory the Great Academy, Mercer County, New Jersey. Mr. Green says, thanks so much for getting this channel to 1,000 subscribers. It would not have happened without you guys. I hope you keep watching the videos, and most importantly, I hope you keep reading, writing, learning, and studying about history. I'll see you soon.